Thank
there
you.
is. That's that 1 foot 10 inches you talked about. That's DOT. That's a specification.
Excuse me, Gary Vecchio, could you please mute your line?
Yeah, hold on.
Vince, you're on mute. I promise it wasn't me this time.
All right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's try this again. Good morning, everyone. Hello, and thank you for coming. Thank you for taking part of your busy day to talk about this important topic. Our plan today is to kind of give everyone updates as to where we are, what our plans are for the coming year for the resilient environmental landscapes rulemaking that we intend to undertake, and to kind of explain the background, the purpose, the vision for it, and also to give an opportunity for people to ask questions so that you can understand what our position is and why we're doing what we're doing and why we think it's important. So I look forward to the conversation, and let me begin. All right, so as mentioned on the first slide, this was all predicated by
Vince,
Governor.
Just give it a second. It hasn't popped up to full screen.
Oh, you don't see my slide yet?
It's just in a little box for me, so it's not the full screen. Maybe try sharing it again.
Okay.
I think Teams might be struggling a little bit with just having this many people on. There we go. We got it. Good.
Is that better? Okay.
Yep.
Good. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, let me go back to the first slide since it's important. So Governor Murphy's Executive Order 100 in January 2020 set DEP on a path of revising our regulations as necessary to address climate threats in New Jersey. And we've done a little bit of that in the current proposal that's on the street now, the Inland Flood Protection Rule. And this presentation will focus on the rest of the rulemaking that we intend to undertake. And whereas the Inland Flood Protection Rule focuses on just that, inland flood protection and increased flooding driven by increased precipitation due to climate change, this rulemaking focuses more on the coastal flood hazard area and what is happening along the coast as a result of sea level rise. So there are 5 fundamental pieces or themes, let's say, to this rulemaking, and we're going to go over each one. The first one is the longest one because it has the most pieces to it. But as I mentioned earlier, you might want to wait to the end of the segment if you have any questions, because some of your questions might be answered by the slides that are coming up. Certainly at the end of the segment, I'll pause and give people an opportunity to ask questions. But if there's something that needs clarification as I'm going through, feel free to interrupt me and ask the question, because we're here for you. We want you to understand our position, and this is actually very helpful to us as well, because we want to hear from you. We want to get this right. This is important. So the first piece is adjusting the coastal flood hazard area to account for rising sea levels and attendant storm surge, extending jurisdictional area further inland, and requiring higher first floor elevations and floodproofing. So I have all sorts of maps and drawings and whatnot to illustrate this, but the long and short of it is that as sea levels are rising, there's 2 things that will happen. There'll be more land that's either regularly twice a day or permanently underwater, and flood elevations will continue to rise. And what is the proper response to that? And that's what we'll be talking about. The second is to remedy concerns that FEMA has had about our state's consistency with the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm going to go through the what's and the whys of that, but there are clarifying amendments to the flood hazard rules that we'll be proposing. We endeavor to support renewable energy through certain amendments. We're balancing the habitat conservation with infrastructure demands. So dealing with things like cable placement, shellfish, all that world of things. So we'll talk about that today. And one main theme that's kind of all throughout the rule is encouraging nature-based solutions and improving our regulatory protections of our resources. We've seen over and over again that nature-based solutions, for example, having not a structural seawall in some cases, but having, for example, having a vegetated bank. We've seen this in inland areas along riverine systems where we've allowed walls to be built along a river because it was eroding, and then it just deflects the energy and it causes erosion downstream. So having an integration of soil and vegetation and rock and natural means is more resilient in general. Now, obviously, there's reasons why we can't always do that, but the rule encourages that, promotes that, makes it easier to do that. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about our permitting process, including pathways for expediting projects. And this relates a lot to our reporting and how people we authorize people to do activities and how we keep track of it as the process is going along. So there are two fundamental updates to the flood hazard rules and the CZM rules. And this is the big part. One is that there's a fundamental update to our standards, and there's a fundamental update to our process. The standard update would fix sea level rise, the data gap requiring higher first floor elevations, as I mentioned, or floodproofing if you're non-residential, non-critical, in a larger area that is slightly more inland than today's floodplain, because if the flood elevation is increasing, as I'll show you, then it will extend further inland, and that means the regulatory floodplain would be larger. Not significantly so, but it will grow as a result of sea level rise. And the second is the process. There's really two reasons why we're doing all of this. One is, of course, to protect public safety, right? But there's the economic side of things and there's the decision-making side of things. So to the extent that we can help people understand what the risks are for development in these areas and what the risks may be in the future, and making sure that folks that are buying property, choosing a place to live, choosing a place to work, municipalities looking for siting of critical infrastructure and whatnot, we want to inform them of the risks that we're aware of, and we want that to be a big part of the process. And so we'll talk about that as well. Some things that I want to clear up too that the rule making would not do: it doesn't create a no build zone. It doesn't say that you cannot build in a certain area, right? It focuses on the conversation about ameliorating flood risk, about making good choices, making sure that everyone is understanding of the responsibility of building in certain areas. It also doesn't affect existing structures unless, of course, the structures are substantially damaged or improved. So some folks have said, you're going to make everyone raise all of the houses on the barrier islands by 5 feet. You're going to make all the roads be raised 5 feet. But no, the rule doesn't do that. It looks prospectively at new development and redevelopment. And also, of course, if there's, as I mentioned, substantially damaged or improved structures. And it doesn't impede projects already in the pipeline. Now, what I mean by that is that if an application is submitted to DEP prior to adoption of this rule, then these standards wouldn't apply. Now, our timeline for that, we anticipate filing the proposal in the second quarter of 2023, around the same time that we would adopt the inland flood protection rule. That's our target. And the second piece would be to adopt those rules in early 2024. So if you apply for a coastal zone management permit or a flood hazard permit, and it's before we adopt the rules, likely in the first quarter of 2024, then these standards wouldn't apply. The current standards would apply. So I'm sure in other presentations, many of you have seen these cartoon drawings that I put together over the years, but I think that it helps to illustrate what we're talking about. So here is, you can see the current shoreline and you can see the current sea level. And what we're talking about with sea level rise is this land that's in between the current shoreline and the future shoreline. This is what we're calling the inundation risk zone. So this is land that is today above the mean higher high water line, but because of sea level rise will at some point either be inundated twice daily by high tide or will be underwater all the time. And so obviously it's important to take a very close look at the type of activities that would be taking place in this area and making sure that there's proper disclosure, because it's a hazardous area to be in. The corollary to this is that you have today's 100-year floodplain, and that is going to increase as a result of sea level rise, at least as much as the sea level rise is increasing. So a 2-foot rise in sea level will translate into at least a 2-foot rise in flood elevations and so on. And so what this illustrates is that this home lies outside today's 100-year floodplain. This home does not need flood insurance today. This home does not know that it's at risk. The homeowner does not know. At some point, though, as flood elevations creep inland, this house will be at risk. And we want people to understand that when they're building and when they're redeveloping. Now, the way this kind of plays out, as you can see, is we have 4 basic zones, right? Zone 1, so these correspond to these 4 different zones here. So the first one is the current inundation area. So this is the land that lies below the mean high water line. Then there's the inundation risk zone. You can see this boardwalk is in it, and this poor person is walking in it. The third piece, this is the extent of the current 100-year floodplain, and this is the extent of the future 100-year floodplain. So different standards and different disclosures and different questions and different proofs are required depending on where you build, which zone you build in. Now, the basics of this is that as sea levels rise, the more land is regularly or permanently inundated. And more inundation, the higher the sea levels go, the higher the flood elevations go. And higher flood elevations mean more recurring flood damage. The problem is that our rules are based on current mapping, and the current mapping doesn't take into account future changes. It's based on historical trends from the past, because that's what mapping does. And it looks at recurrence intervals from data from over the past decades, and it doesn't include any kind of change based on sea level rise. So people that are building today to the current standards aren't going to be accommodating or dealing with these issues, and it's important that we do. Now, everyone has seen the Rutgers staff report, and so I didn't reproduce it here. But if you look at the staff report, there is a very interesting kind of array of projected sea level rise based on probability and year and emission scenarios. So in New Jersey, by the year 2100, which is our planning horizon, assuming a moderate emission scenario, there will be between a 2.1 and a 5.1 foot of sea level rise by 2100. That's the likely range. So we're focusing on the upper side of the high range, of the likely range, because we want to make sure that folks are protected. If they're investing more time and energy in developing to these higher standards, we want to make sure that they're protected, not just for today, but for the future. Now, if you look at the Rutgers staff report, the worst case scenario, if there's high emissions levels and there are, and it's the highest end of the probability, it's as much as 8.8 feet. So there's a whole array, but it's a statistical analysis, and we've chosen 5.1 feet of sea level rise to be our target. And well, as I mentioned before, reliance on incomplete or inaccurate data in the past leads to inadequate risk assessment. So people don't know the risks of what they're doing and where they're doing it and why they're doing it. And that also can lead to substandard designs for critical buildings and infrastructure. So for design for criteria for buildings and infrastructure. So people that are erecting homes or businesses today, are they flood-proofed enough for the future, and so on. So here's another drawing or schematic that I think helps illustrate this. Here's the current sea level, and you can see in parentheses it says MHHW. That stands for mean high water line. So kudos to anyone who knows what that stands for, but I'll explain it. So twice a day we get high tides, and one is a little higher than the other. And so this is the average over a period of time of the higher of the 2 high tides, right? So that is the extent of the average extent that the higher high water line would come today. So you see the current shoreline there, and this home has a dock. Well, if there's 5 feet of future sea level rise, then the mean high water line would go up, and the future shoreline would go inland, put more land underwater, either twice a day because of high tide or permanently, and that is called the inundation risk zone. Then the corollary is here's today's floodplain, and here's tomorrow's floodplain. So this homeowner has some trouble here, right? Hopefully here under the current floodplain, they know that they're in a floodplain and they have flood insurance. You only need flood insurance if you're in a mapped floodplain and if you have a mortgage. No one's going to require you to have it other than that. So there are a lot of folks that don't know that they're in a flood zone. There's a lot of folks that rely on that line on the map. And as I've said, the flood doesn't know it's supposed to stop at that line on the map. And so over time, the risk increases, and more people that are building in this outer area, which is not protected today, could be at risk if we don't adopt protections. So what are the changes? What are these rule changes? The changes will help build resilience to sea level rise and storm surge in new development and improve risk disclosure. The climate adjusted flood elevation, which is what we're calling the floodplain because it's adjusted floodplain, adjusted for climate elevation, for climate change, extends further inland than the existing 100-year. So that means that the first floor of buildings or floodproofing is required in more areas than today's 100-year floodplain. The second is risk assessment and evaluation of alternatives in the inundation risk zone. The areas where regular or permanent standing water is expected because of sea level rise. And the third is updated notice requirements. The flood hazard rules already have some noticing requirements. If there's new development in a flood zone, there's disclosures that need to be placed on the deed of the property so that people that buy it or rent it in the future know. But this expands that and clarifies it. So what this looks like is that under today's rules on the left side, you can see that the current flood hazard rules set the coastal design flood elevation is equal to FEMA's base flood elevation, right? So along the coast, our state design flood is FEMA's 100-year flood. And we use the higher of preliminary maps or effective maps. And of course, people can always recalculate it if they don't believe that, or they can go to FEMA and they can dispute the mapping and give better information that would adjust that. But absent any of that, we would use the higher of the effective or the preliminary map. And we add what we call a factor safety of 1 foot to that. So that means that if you're in that designated special flood hazard area, then buildings need to be elevated 1 foot above that. The walking surface of the floor has to be 1 foot above. If you're in a coastal A zone or V zone, then the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member of the building has to be elevated 1 foot above that design flood elevation. And if it's a non-residential building and raising it doesn't make sense, then you can floodproof it. But again, you'd floodproof it to 1 foot above that design flood. So the takeaway is that today, that the first floors and roads too, to the extent that you can, have to be built 1 foot above FEMA's flood elevation through either elevation or floodproofing for buildings, or in the case of roads, being built to be more resilient and as high as you can. Roadways obviously have a lot of their own challenges to be able to raise them. After Hurricane Sandy, when Route 35 was being rebuilt, we couldn't raise it because there were 1,000 driveways that were tying into it, and so DOT couldn't do that. But there are places where we can add value and roadways can be made safer. So we'll talk about that too. The other side is what we propose to do in the future. The anticipated 5 feet of sea level rise would increase flood elevations by 5 feet. So that means the new coastal design flood elevation would be equal to FEMA plus 5. And then, of course, there's that 1 foot factor safety that still would be there. So what we're saying then is that the first floors and roads, the target would be the FEMA elevation plus 6, either through elevation or floodproofing. Now, we all recognize that that's not always achievable. And so there's off ramps in the rule and places where demonstrations can be made where, okay, maybe you can't go quite that high, but maybe there's something you can do. Maybe you can get part of the way there through certain modifications to buildings and roads. So here's kind of what this looks like in the real world. And if you haven't played around with this, I recommend that you do. This is NJ Flood Mapper, and it's an online tool that you can place into it. You can tell it to show you what incremental changes in climate change and sea level rise would cause. So you can see what 1 foot of sea level rise, or 2 feet, or 3 feet, or 4 feet, and you can overlay flood mapping. There are a number of different things that you can do. So here is obviously Cape May, and this is just showing an aerial view of it, the base map. And here's what 5 feet of sea level rise would look like on Cape May. So the blue areas and the green areas would be land that would be permanently or twice a day underwater if there was 5 feet of sea level rise. This is not an insignificant portion of the state, obviously, and of this area. Now I've overlaid, and I'm going to toggle back and forth so you can kind of see. This is FEMA's 100-year floodplain mapping, right? The orange represents the 500-year flood. Everything that's in blue, light blue, is the 100-year floodplain. The dark blue is just the ocean. So I'm going to toggle back and forth so you can see the difference between the inundation risk zone, this sea level plus 5 feet, and today's 100-year flood. So you can see that the inundation risk zone is all within today's 100-year floodplain. 100-year floodplain goes further inland because the 100-year floodplain is more than 5 feet above the mean high water line in most cases. And this is what the floodplain looks like if you add 5 feet to it. Let me toggle back and forth. So the light orange here represents the land. So the blue is the existing 100-year flood, and the light orange represents the places where the floodplain would increase due to 5 feet of adding 5 feet to the existing flood elevation. These kind of brownish areas, these are V zones and open water areas, so that's not really part of our discussion. So we're looking at the orange part here. So what are the risk-based procedural differences in how we deal with these different areas? So the inundation risk zone, this is again where regular or permanent standing water is expected due to sea level rise. There's really 3 things. One is a climate impact assessment by the applicant. This is a narrative. It's not decisional in the sense that if you don't answer the questions correctly, that you don't get your permit, but it's a detailed narrative that's guided by the rulemaking that would say, have you evaluated your risks? Have you evaluated what would happen to your property, to your development if you had 5 feet of sea level rise? What is your contingency plan? What can you do to ameliorate those flood risks? The second thing is a climate risk alternatives analysis. Now, when we say alternatives analysis, I don't mean saying you want to build a house, we'll find another place to build it. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that on a given site, and given the parameters of a development, there are often ways that risk can be avoided or minimized or ameliorated. And so, for example, and we see this today in today's flood hazard area, let's say that someone has a piece of property and part of it's in today's floodplain and part of it's outside of today's floodplain. Now, sometimes based on the size of the building or the zoning or the topography of the site or the location of roads and so on, there's really no way to relocate this outside the floodplain. But you might be able to shift part of the building outside of the floodplain and therefore lower your risk. Or you might be able to raise up the ground a bit and minimize the flooding. And so since the inundation risk zone is based on land that lies within 5 feet of mean high water line, there's an opportunity where maybe you could raise the ground and take it out of, or at least less inundated by the inundation risk zone. It's not required. This climate alternatives analysis is not required for commercial development. It's not required for recreational and entertainment or hospitality and gaming. So what it is required for is places where people are living, and so residential buildings and also critical buildings. And what I mean by critical buildings is buildings that are relied upon by the community during a flood or after the flood to facilitate recovery, right? So a critical building could be a school, a hospital, a shelter, places where people are congregating, like detention facilities and things like that. So it's very important that we have the highest bar for those. And then the third piece is a risk acknowledgement. Again, it kind of goes back to the first one where you have the climate impact assessment. So once you've had that narrative, this is a shorter narrative that is based on that climate impact assessment that would be recorded within the deed of the property, which again, as I mentioned, the flood hazard rules already require in the title of the building. So that way future occupants of these buildings, future purchasers of these buildings will know, okay, this is the risk that the state of New Jersey has determined is likely to occur at this property over time. And so that way that helps people make better informed decisions, because the better and more well-informed folks are, the better decisions that they make. If you think about anything in your life, if you don't know how much money's in your bank account, you don't know how much you can spend for the holidays. So you need to understand what the impacts are. You need to understand what the risks are, and you can make better choices that way. Now, in the larger coastal flood hazard area itself, right, so outside the inundation risk zone, So this would be the current floodplain and the future floodplain outside the inundation risk zone. There's a less process, a shorter process, right? So we're not requiring climate impact assessments or alternatives analysis. Of course, we're always going to have that conversation with applicants to find if there's a way to ameliorate flood risk on the site, right? Because we view our permitting process as adding value and helping people to be safer. So we would have that conversation. And there's a short form, we'll call it, on risk acknowledgement. Again, that's recorded in the notice of the title of the property. Again, existing requirement, but it would be amplified as part of this rulemaking. So that's the first theme. And before I go to the second one, which relates to FEMA and our relationship with the National Flood Insurance Program, I'm going to give an opportunity to folks if they have any questions about anything I've said so far.
I don't see any raised hands. Just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question, there's a button called reactions up at the top of the screen. If you click on that, you'll see that there's a hand raise that you can use.
So I see a question about the schedule. I think it was put in the chat. So,
and then we do have a hand raise too after that.
Okay, cool. So the schedule is simply that we anticipate filing this rule proposal in the second quarter of 2023. So filing the proposal means giving it to the Office of Administrative Law, and they would review it and publish it in the New Jersey Register as a proposal, and then there'd be a comment response period, and then we'd respond to all those comments, and we anticipate adopting it in the early part of 2024, the first quarter. So again, projects that come to DEP for applications that are received as complete prior to the date of adoption in 2024 would not be affected by these changes.
Okay, Jared Thomas, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. So I had a another call with the Association of State Floodplain Managers a few days back, and they had indicated that the recently passed federal infrastructure bill was going to authorize NOAA to update the atlas from 14 to 15, and part of those changes would include climate change factors and as well as provide information to update the federal flood maps. Are these proposed changes more stringent, less stringent, the same as what's being proposed by New Jersey?
So that's a great question. I'm not fully familiar with the anticipated changes on the federal level, but so I can't really compare them. But what I will say though is that this proposal and the inland flood protection rule that we propose is based on the best available science that we have. And we recognize that mapping could change in the future, that NOAA could change their rainfall data and whatnot. So we will adapt to that. So this is an absence of that. If there's changes on the mapping or with the rainfall data, then we'll address that in the rulemaking. I see a question in the chat about, will copies of this PowerPoint be made available after this morning's meeting? Yes. So I believe it will be posted on our website, and the recording will also be posted on the website. All right, well, I'm going to launch into the next step, but if you're like me and about 10 minutes later, you realize, oh, I should have asked a question about slide number 6, no problem. We can go back. I want to make sure that we address everyone's current concerns to the extent that we can. Okay, so the second piece relates to our relationship at the state with the National Flood Insurance Program and how we meet the minimum federal requirements. So this is very important, and I'm sure everybody on the call knows this, but I'll cover this just so that we have the same thoughts. One is that through the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA establishes minimum flood reduction standards that communities voluntarily adhere to. And if you do, then you are eligible to receive disaster relief money. You're eligible for federally backed flood insurance for the residents and businesses in that community. So nearly every community in the state agrees to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And that means necessarily meeting at least the minimum standards that FEMA has set. And FEMA encourages, as does the state, encourages local governments to adopt more protective standards that's appropriate for that community. Now, by and large, our flood hazard rules are equally or more protective than the minimum federal standards, right? So, for example, in riverine systems, FEMA looks at the special flood hazard area, which is the 100-year flood, but we regulate a flood that's bigger than that already, and we have for decades. Flood that's 25% bigger flow, or at least 1 foot higher than that. We have freeboard requirements. We have different things that FEMA's minimum standards don't have. However, in May of 2020, FEMA released a very detailed assessment of our rules. And there were a number of places where they focused on our rules and said, we don't know, we suspect, and we have some evidence that maybe the NFIP standards are not uniformly achieved by these rules. And what happens, right, on the local level, because New Jersey has this robust floodplain management program and has had it since 1929 in one form or another, unlike most states which rely on community level engagement and not state level engagement. Because of that, if the state issues a flood hazard permit or a coastal permit, then it's taken by local governments as, well, this must meet the minimum NFIP standards. And by and large it does, but there could be places where, for example, if the flood hazard rules allow a hardship exception, it might not be a waivable requirement under the minimum federal standards. So obviously we want to make sure that any permits that we're issuing at the state level meet or exceed those federal minimums. So that way the communities aren't put at risk. That way the state of New Jersey is doing its job to protect people. So any place in the rule where there's an opportunity or a potential opportunity for us to issue a permit that's less protective than the federal minimum is going to be addressed. Now, in the inland flood protection rule, there's a blanket statement that says that the department will not approve a permit if it doesn't meet these federal minimums. But there are places throughout the rule that we need to adjust in order to make that not happen. Any questions about that one? For now? Okay, well, I'll just keep going. And like I said, please feel free to interrupt because we're here for you. The third theme is supporting renewable energy, and that means amendments to the coastal zone management rules that balance habitat conservation with new infrastructure demands because of the location of offshore wind and whatnot. And this is important because we want to promote offshore wind and we want to protect the resources, the coastal resources. So striking this balance means amending the coastal rules to address the installation of transmission cables through certain areas. Because if you have an offshore wind facility, you need places to you need the ability to transmit the electricity from the wind turbine to the shore, right? So does that go through shellfish habitat? Does it, what kind of public safety issues are there? So the rule addresses that. And then it also deals with public notice requirements for those electric transmission cables, because we want to make sure that people in the future, if they're fishing, if they're using those areas, they understand where the cables are and how to avoid the impacts to those cables. The fourth piece, encouraging nature-based solutions. So that means not just shoreline protection or bank stabilization, but it also means better stormwater management practices. It means improved water quality, improving water quality where we can, especially in urban areas where the water quality is degraded, and in source areas like the headwaters. So there are a lot of things throughout the rules that address this issue, and there's themes all throughout it, but I'm going to hit kind of the high points as a conversation starter for it. So nature-based solutions, right? These have multiple co-benefits: carbon sequestration, I can never say that word, habitat, wave attenuation, recreation, and so on. So putting back natural systems to combat changing climates is always more resilient. It's always it's always more resilient. It's always going to be more protective. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes the wave action is so great along the coast, or the velocity in a river is so great that you have to have hard armoring or some other kind of solution. But in general, this works. And so we want to streamline the permitting process to encourage these things, right? The flood hazard rules and the coastal zone rules, a lot of that was developed over the years to address development. And it doesn't always do a great job addressing things like we want to make things better, right? The focus on the rules largely is don't make things worse, right? You can build your thing, protect the people the best you can, and don't make things worse. But we're not going to get to actual combating of climate change that's going to be successful unless we take the next step and say, can we make things better? What can we do at the state level to encourage the use of techniques and solutions that have a longer resilience time frame, and also doesn't fall into the category of just development per se. So, for example, if you have wetlands areas that are sinking, or because of sea level rise encroaching, you've got like these wetland marshes along the coast that are slowly being inundated. So maybe beneficial reuse of dredged material from the harbor, put it in the areas where the land is being becoming underwater because of climate change. That is a way that you can keep the wetlands there. You have a disposal place for your dredged material, and it's a nice balance between the two. So it's things like that. And there are changes to general permits in the coastal rules that we propose. There are facilitations and encouragements in the rules that you'll see when the proposal comes out. So the next piece of this is how we can improve our protection of land and water resources. So we have a few categories. First is stormwater management. And these are kind of big ones. Today, if you're familiar with our stormwater management rules, and of course it applies to major developments, which is you're disturbing an acre of land, or you're cumulatively increasing impervious coverage or motor vehicle surface by a quarter of an acre, then you trigger the stormwater rules and you meet the standards. But we've all seen situations where there's a redevelopment project, historic pavement that was there 50 years, 100 years, and there's a redevelopment plan, which is a good thing, and we want to encourage that, obviously. And the redevelopment plan does not increase the amount of impervious surface or motor vehicle surface. So there's no requirement in our current rules to do anything for water quality. And we're not going, as I mentioned before, we're not going to be able to address the impairments of our waters, and we're not going to be able to address the increases of these impairments due to climate change and flooding unless we take a look at ways that redevelopment projects can meet the same water quality standards as new development. Now, that's not always achievable. It's not meant to make redevelopment projects any harder. It's intended to make them safer, and it's intended primarily to improve the water quality in the receiving watersheds. The second thing is to promote retention of stormwater runoff on site. So on-site retention, this has been stakeholder before, and this will have a water quality benefit and a flood amelioration benefit as well. And again, there are off ramps to that because there's certain areas where you can't retain the water. There's certain areas because of the source material, or just like our recharge standards. There's places where this doesn't make sense from just a physical location, and so on, or the soil type. So there's off ramps to that. But where stormwater can be retained, the rule promotes that. And then the third piece to this, and this is kind of an odd gap. If today you need a coastal zone management permit or a flood hazard permit, and your project is for a major development, right? It triggers the stormwater rules. Then you need to demonstrate to the state that you meet the stormwater management rules, 7:8. It doesn't matter how much of the project is in the coastal zone. It doesn't matter how much of the project is in the flood hazard area. So you could have a situation where you have 100 homes and the project is a major development and only one home is in the floodplain or riparian zone, and the whole project has to meet the stormwater rules, right? Because that's an opportunity for us to ensure that value is being added and that the rules are being met. But our freshwater wetlands rules are written a little differently. And under that, it says the activity under a general permit, because most of what we see are general permits or transition area waivers or approvals. The activity itself has to be a major development within the wetlands or transition area. So it's very rare that we would have an acre of disturbance of wetlands, or an acre of disturbance of transition area, or a quarter acre of impervious surface or motor vehicle surface in the wetlands or transition area itself. So a lot of times what happens is, let's say somebody comes in for a GP10 and there's a minor road crossing, and it's a very small part that's actually within the wetlands. It could be for an enormous development, but we're not looking at stormwater management. So the change here would make the stormwater rules, the freshwater wetlands rules, the same as the coastal and the flood hazard rules, so that if you need a permit from us and it's a major development, then we would look at the stormwater management plan. The second piece or third piece, I guess, to this is improving riparian zone protections. So that there's a number of places where we do that, but one is improving protection of headwater streams in the upper reaches of watersheds. So those familiar with the flood hazard rules know that streams that drain less than 50 acres, that don't have discernible bed and bank, or which are isolated, not connected to other waters, are not covered by the flood hazard rule and therefore don't have a riparian zone. But there are cases where you have these headwater streams that have a bed and bank, but it's not connected to the overall water system, right? We see this in areas where karst topography is present, where you can have a channel that just disappears into the ground and a couple hundred feet away it pops up again. All the water's getting to where it needs to go. It's all getting to the receiving water body, but we don't have riparian zone protections along those. So the rulemaking would look at those areas and place protections that are appropriate in those headwater areas. The second thing that it does, and this is again a sort of an oddity in the rules, is it addresses riparian zones on barrier islands. Now, the way it's worded today in the flood hazard rules, that if you have a barrier island complex, if you have a barrier island or the islands that are associated with it, and on the ocean, nowhere around that entire barrier island do you have a riparian zone, neither the bay side of it or the ocean side. Now, we agree that it's appropriate to not have the riparian zone on the ocean side because the coastal zone management rules have different types of protections there, and it's a different dynamic there. But the bay side of a barrier island is no particularly different than the mainland side of the bay, right? So what you have is, for example, along Barnegat Bay, which is a Category 1 water, if you're on the mainland side of Barnegat Bay, not on the barrier island, and you discharge stormwater into the bay, you have to meet elevated stormwater management requirements, 95% TSS removal and so on. If you're on the barrier island itself and you're discharging into that same bay, there's no standard for water quality. So because of if there's no riparian zone requirement, so it doesn't trigger that. So that's something that we feel we should address and make sure that our bays are protected all the way around with the same level of standards of riparian zones and water quality and so on. And the last piece to this is improving protections of freshwater wetlands and transition areas. So what do I mean by that? One is that, and this is seems kind of obvious, but the rules are not explicit in this manner. Applicants should be, in our opinion, required to demonstrate that wetlands impacts are actually necessary for a conduct of a project, right? Because the purpose of the freshwater wetlands rules is to minimize, is to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to freshwater wetlands and transition areas. So if there is a reasonable way that can be done on a site with the project still being accomplished, then this is a conversation that is appropriate in the context of a wetlands permit, just like we do today for siting of projects in the coastal zone or siting of projects in the flood hazard area. So we're not talking about a no build scenario here. We're talking about optimizing the project so that the development occurs and the least amount of resource impact occurs. The second is to require certain assessments when impacts are proposed in vernal habitats, right? So under GP6, there's language that folks need to, for an isolated water, that folks need to address. This would focus on those cases where vernal habitats are present and require an assessment of the impacts to the vernal habitat of the project. The next two relate to transition areas within 25 feet of a freshwater wetlands. So right now, under certain special activity waivers, you can get up to within 10 feet of a freshwater wetland, and there's no requirement to necessarily restore that transition area within wetlands if you're doing work within it. Now, if you're familiar with the flood hazard rules under the riparian zone standards, that inner 25 feet from the top of bank is an area where there's a very high bar for development. Really only in very minor, limited cases can you be in there. So like water dependent uses, stormwater discharges, that things. But if you want to put a home within 25 feet of the top of bank, then then we would want you to set that further back. So we're doing the same thing with freshwater wetlands. If you're proposing an activity in a transition area, we want it to be at least 25 feet away from the wetlands. And if you're redeveloping the land, you might have a situation where the pavement goes right up to the wetlands limit and you're redeveloping that. If there's an opportunity to do so, and again, there's off ramps that are very similar to what are in the flood hazard rules in 11.2 V and W near the end of the section that talk about how you restore these areas. And actually we moved it to C, I believe. So it's in there. If you look in section 11.2 in the flood hazard rules, you'll see what you can and can't do within 25 feet of repairing zone and how you have to restore it. And this is very similar to that. So because there's an opportunity to pull back pavement, we want that to happen. And then the final piece is that if there is an averaging plan, then the entire transition area should be protected by conservation restriction. This is the way we did it for years. It changed a few years ago. We believe that the way that we had done it is appropriate to meet the requirements of the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act. And so therefore, we want to ensure that that occurs. Now for habitat protection, now this is an interesting one, and this goes back to kind of what I said before about keeping the status quo or making things better. So right now we have a general permit in the flood hazard rules that allow, in some cases, what I'll call in-kind bridge or culvert replacement. And and the thinking there is that if you already have a bridge or a culvert and you're just basically putting back the same thing, you're not going to affect flooding, which is probably true. But flooding is not the only thing that we look at under the flood hazard rules or other rules. So we look at habitat, we look at endangered species, we look at riparian zone impacts, and so on. And sometimes roadways or railroads can truncate or fragment endangered species habitat. So we've all seen this before, like we've done presentations on it before, where you've got endangered species habitat on one side of a road, or maybe both sides of a road, and the protected species are trying to get from one side to the other. So they're going up and over the road, and that leads to high species mortality, that leads to car accidents. It's not good for anyone. So recognizing that this can't always be done because of hydraulics and other factors, if a bridge or culvert's being replaced and there's an opportunity to install habitat fragmentation devices that would reduce that, we want that to be addressed. In other words, if there's a way to convey the species from one side of the road to the other by going under the road instead of over the road, if that can be done and accomplished within the scope of the project and within, given the limitations, maybe because of the hydraulics and whatnot, then we think that that's appropriate. So that means removing the general permit for this, because the general permit basically says, just keep what you got. We're cool if you do that. We think that things can be improved. And they can't always be improved, but where they can be, we feel they should be. And so that's this change. And then the last piece of the improvements to protection of land and water resources relates to mitigation requirements. And there's two pieces to that. One is for the riparian zone. And we're proposing enhanced mitigation requirements when riparian zone impacts are exceeded in certain cases. So right now, if you're in a 300-foot riparian zone with a couple off ramps, again, for minor disturbances and whatnot, or certain types of disturbance, you need to mitigate fully for your impacts to your 300-foot riparian zone. And we're doing something similar in the proposal with 150 and 50-foot riparian zones. Not that you would have to mitigate for all of it. You'd have different thresholds, higher thresholds, but if your impacts cumulatively on a site go above a certain amount, then it requires mitigation for that amount. And part of that is because of the cumulative impacts on a site. The way the riparian zone is structured, the standards in section 11.2, it talks of the flood hazard rules. It talks about if you build a road, do it this way. If you build an outfall, do it this way. If you build a trail, if you do, and so there's any number of things that you can do in the riparian zone if you meet standards, and each one has a limit. And you can rack up a lot of riparian zone disturbance under an IP without having to do any kind of mitigation. And so we feel that instead of focusing on the individual impact, we should look at the cumulative impact on the site. And so the rulemaking addresses that. And then the last piece, and this is very important, when people are proposing mitigation projects. And the rules would require an evaluation as to how climate change might impact the viability of that project. So for example, if you're proposing a mitigation project in the inundation risk zone, and we're saying that by the end of the century, we believe this area is going to be underwater, it might not serve the purpose that the mitigation facility was intended to serve. Or it could be that the changing climate changes the hydrology in the area. What does that look like? Because we want to make sure that mitigation projects are around forever, right? Because it's mitigating an impact. So to the extent that we can evaluate it, this becomes part of that viability assessment for the mitigation project. I think I might have seen a question pop up by someone. Maybe a couple questions. I don't know.
There's a couple questions. I think the one here, though, is related to what you were just talking to. So would improve habitat protection include wildlife crossings under the road or bridge? Would we have to have pre-apps before or during the design stage to ensure this is addressed early in the design stages?
So yes, the rulemaking would do that. It would require that where it can be done. And I always think that in cases like this, where there's a complex suite of regulatory requirements and impacts and design criteria, that it's always a good thing to sit down with the staff and talk it through and see if there's any ways to improve it, see if there's any issues with the application. You know, just knowing whether or not there is fragmentation of habitat there. That's a big one, right? So at the Flood Hazard Technical Manual goes a long way to talk about that, but nothing beats actually sitting down face to face or computer to computer and going over a plan and talking about what the project is. Any other questions, Lauren? I can't quite see them.
There are, and I just want to have a reminder that we would prefer that if you can to raise your hand for questions. That way we can interact better directly with you. And just to remind you to state your name and organization. Yes, we have a question from Dan Kennedy.
Hey, Dan.
Danny, how are you?
Good.
Dan Kennedy, Utility and Transportation Contractors Association, hope all is well. So the inland flood rule, we got a presentation like this, kind of bulleted points, but no backup with the actual details of the rule, which I think kind of helped accelerate some of the fears about what the rule was and what it could do. Given this is like the rest of the 90%, does the department have any plans to release more details of what these rules? You say there's off ramps and, you know, we'll be fine. Trust us. This is not crazy. Well, I mean, what are you going to show past this in the next quarter or two that helps us understand the details of this better?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right, because this is a high level overview. We can't really get into the weeds just because of the time of it, and there's so many different pieces to it. You're absolutely right. So really, what our plan is to be available in January for topical meetings. So if you or the folks that you represent or other people on the call are concerned about a particular issue, like how this rulemaking might affect this, or how this rulemaking addresses this other thing, then we can have targeted discussions with you in January, and we can get further into the weeds with the proposal on it. Right. So we're with you.
Okay, gotcha. We'll take you up on that, because I didn't hear anything about like state planning commission centers, other general permits, horizontal directional drilling, a lot of the things that were stakeholdered earlier that I haven't heard anything about. I don't know whether to assume that that's not part of this, or it is. It's just in that detail that you're breezing past. So we'll take you up on that, and we'll talk more about it in January.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan.
All right, Jared Thomas.
Hi. So earlier you had mentioned that promotion. One of the changes in the storm rules was going to be promotion of stormwater retention on site. The current GI rules, don't allow you to infiltrate the entirety of the 210 or the 100-year storm, barring like that happening in the existing condition. Will that restriction be lifted?
That's a good question, and the focus is a little different. It's not intending to infiltrate the entire 100-year, but it's intended to retain and infiltrate some of the smaller storms regularly throughout. So It's a parallel but similar process, but it's not exactly the same goal, right? Because the recharge requirements are simply to do that, right? To encourage groundwater recharge so that our aquifers are not depleted and all the other good benefits of groundwater recharge. This is more related to offsite flooding and water quality attenuation.
Oh, okay.
A good question, Jared. Thank you. And we could do a whole talk just on that one item, right? Which I think is kind of Dan's point, is that there's so many pieces to this that we're happy to engage folks with in January. And we can get more into the weeds and kind of go through some of the permutations of it.
Dave Pringle?
Hey, Dave. Dave, I'm wondering if you're muted because I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Sorry about that. I'm multitasking at the State House and Senate Environment Committee meeting. Thank you very much for, actually, let me get to a quieter hallway. Thank you very much for this briefing. We have been working on this for decades and are woefully behind. Stronger rules can't happen fast enough to protect people, property, and our wallets and pocketbooks. And, very much appreciate all the work the DEP is doing. But, on this rule and the whole rest of the PAC rules, we're, depending on how you count, at least 1 to 2 years behind the pace the governor ordered with Executive Order 100 to, less than 3 years ago. And we're already 1 to 2 years behind. And the things where we have moved forward have even been weakened, like the inland flood rules and the boiler rules. So the question is, what have we learned from the last couple of years? How can we move these things better forward, faster? Not only to stop the backsliding, but to move forward. What have we learned? How do we go from here? How do we not repeat the mistakes of the last 2 years in this effort?
I appreciate what you're saying, Dave. So I think one thing that we shouldn't miss is the complexity, right, of all of this and how it fits together. The rulemaking as it stands now, I think it's over 1,000 pages long if you print it out, and which we don't do because we're trying to save paper, just to point that out. And so there's so many interacting pieces and so many different communities that are impacted by this. We wanted to get it right, and so it took longer than we would have liked it to, as the process. And these meetings here are intended to kind of make sure everybody realizes what our plan is, and then it's an invitation to further discussions before a proposal. And as I mentioned, our plan is to have this proposed around the same time that the Inland Flood Protection Rule is adopted, and to adopt this piece as soon as we can, which 9 to 12 months is probably the right target for that, is after proposal.
And can you elaborate a little bit on why we're waiting to get the inland flood rule done before we move forward with this? You obviously know where you're headed. Wouldn't it behoove us to have them inform each other in real time and not slow things down for another 6 to 12 months? And also just flagging, I see in the chat that Alan Hunt has a question, but he's unable to raise his hand.
Yeah, I saw that. So I'll Alan, I would just suggest that thank you for pointing that out. Alan, I would suggest that you just type it in the chat if you can't raise your hand.
And Alan, I do have your hand up. You're third in line.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks, Lauren. So this is what's interesting, right? So we filed this rulemaking with Office of Administrative Law. So when we file a proposal, it's about a month before the publication date. And that gives Office of Administrative Law time to review it, make sure that there's no internal inconsistencies or whatnot, make sure everything is explained properly, and then it gets published, right? And then you have the comment period. So first of all, we wouldn't want to propose this rule, at least until we went through the comment response process, because we want to see what people are saying about the first rule, because that'll help inform the second one, which I think was part of your point. The second thing, and this is more of a structural thing, is that these two rules the rulemaking that we just did and the one that we're going to do that we're talking about today open up the same sections of these rules. And so if we had two proposals at the same time, we don't believe that that would meet the intent of the Administrative Procedures Act to have these competing proposals that would amend, for example, the inland flood protection rule is kind of surgical and goes in and adjusts the riverine flood elevation, but it doesn't change the terminology. It doesn't address a lot of that stuff. The second proposal, this big one, would address all of those things holistically. So it repeals all of subchapter 3 in the flood hazard rules and replaces it with new ways to calculate the floodplain. So we couldn't have those two. So we can't really file with Office of Administrative Law this new proposal until we settle on what's happening in inland flood protection rule, because we want to make sure that that informs what we do. And also we want to show people, hey, we're being serious. We're looking at the comments that people are proposing with inland flood protection rule, and that's going to help us with the next piece. But to the extent that we can, if we can get it adopted and the inland flood protection rule adopted and this rulemaking filed at the same time, that is our goal.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Sandy Blick.
Hey, Sandy, I can't hear you, so I'm wondering if maybe you're not, if you're muted. I think the default is that people are muted. I think Sandy's so impressed by the presentation, she's speechless. Lauren, why don't we go to the next person and Sandy can circle back if
Yep, so now we have Alan Hunt.
Hey, Alan.
Great. Hi, Vince. Thank you for holding the stakeholder session here. Two questions. With that 25%, 25-foot setback from the freshwater wetlands that you mentioned as being like a no disturbance area, will that also apply to state open waters and waters of the U.S.?
It applies to transition areas that are adjacent to freshwater wetlands. We have similar protections along state open waters, but it's not exactly the same. I think that's the kind of thing that we could drill down in if we wanted to have a conversation in January about it, because I know we've talked about this a lot. So it's a little different, but it does address it, but not exactly in the same way.
Okay. And then you mentioned with the flood hazard area, looking at discontinuous channels and features that maybe don't have defined bed and bank. Are you applying those same concepts with the ways that state open waters and waters of the U.S. are being identified too, where you may have features that connect maybe through other means than a physical surface feature to receiving water body? The Clean Water Act looks at it from biological, chemical, and physical connectivity. You only need to meet one of those thresholds to be connected in a regulated water. So is that approach also being applied on the Freshwater Wetland Protection Act regulated features in addition to the Flood Hazard Area Control Act regulated features?
So Alan, you were asking about the headwaters in flood hazard, or are you asking about open waters in under wetlands? I'm sorry.
Yep, open waters in freshwater wetlands. So you have the state open waters and the waters of the U.S. there.
Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of goes back to your first question about like what kind of added protections do we have for that, and it's similar, but it's not exactly the same as riparian zones. The riparian zone is the bigger change because, as you know, we have situations where you have a feature with a discernible bed and bank. I have them in the woods behind my house, and then they're not connected to anything, right? It goes into the ground and then it pops up again further down. So because of those connections that you mentioned, because of that, we recognize that these isolated waters are deserving of equal protection as the ones that are connected. So we're focusing mostly on those areas. But does that address your question?
Yeah, I understand in the context of flood hazard area, but that requires a 50-acre drainage basin. You can have other features under freshwater wetland protection rules, which implement waters of the U.S. and state open water protections that maybe have smaller drainage areas, but make connections to like a federal jurisdictional water or an adjacent wetland to a jurisdictional water. So are those features that might have discontinuous channels also being looked at in the same way you're looking at them under the flood hazard rules?
I think I mostly understand what you're asking. I'd like to talk more offline about it so that I can make sure that I address it, but I'll say this. So in flood hazard, we do look at features that drain less than 50 acres if there's a discernible bed and bank and it's naturally occurring, right? So this rulemaking would amplify the protection of those features that drain less than 50 acres, right? So it's in that way we're protecting those same features that you're speaking of. We can't put transition areas on open waters under the Wetlands Act, as far as I understand. So I don't think we can get it directly that way, but because of the overlapping regulations, I think we're protecting the same area. But why don't you work up a couple examples and we can talk about it, and maybe then I can better understand what you're saying.
Sure. Thanks, Vince.
All right, thanks, Alan.
Vince, do you want to finish the presentation or do you want to take more? Because we have a few more, not too much, right?
I just have like 3 more slides and then a slide to say, hey, any questions? So why don't we do that, and then we can use the rest of the time for questions. All right, so the last piece here is the way we're improving our permitting process, and that means a few things. It means how we're addressing our permits by rule, how we're addressing our permits by certification, and then sort of the tracking of activities after we've approved it. So the first piece is what we're calling permits by registration. So the plan is to take all of the permits by rule in the flood hazard rules and the coastal zone management rules. I think there are 91 of them total, and convert them largely. There will be a few exemptions for minor things like normal property maintenance and whatnot, but the rest of them would be converted into what we're calling permits by registration. And what does that mean? It means that so if anyone's undertaking an activity under a permit by rule, the way it works is that the rule adopts the permit. If you think about it this way, there's really only kind of 2 types of permits, right? There's ones that are adopted as part of the rule, and then there's individual permits, right? So permits adopted by the rule are permits by rule, permits by certification, general permits. They exist in the rule, and then depending on what type of permit it is, if it's a general permit, you have to demonstrate compliance with that permit that exists. And then we don't issue a general permit. The general permit's issued in the rule. We issue you an authorization under that general permit, which says, yep, you meet the standards, have at it. Here's your permit. Here's your authorization to work. Permits by certification are similar in the sense that there's an interaction, but it's all online, right? So folks go online, they answer the right questions, they certify certain things, and then they get an instant approval. But permits by rule, we don't even know when people are doing them because they're on the honor basis. So if someone is building an addition to their home or putting in some other structure under a permit by rule, then we can't track it. And not tracking it means 2 things. One is that we can't really assess how these activities are impacting our watersheds, right? We've talked a lot about when we created watershed and land management about having a watershed wide basis for standards, right? We have impaired waters, we have TMDLs in different areas. How do the land use regulations interact with it? How can we track it if we don't know what's being built? And the second piece is FEMA has said to us, well, state of New Jersey, you have these robust flood hazard rules that put standards in place for all sorts of development in the flood hazard area. And we expect you to keep track of that and report it to us. How do you know if someone's building it right? How do you know whether it's even happening at all? So the plan would be to create an online portal for free, no public notice, and basically someone who's intending to undertake a permit by registration would go online, enter in some very basic information, 5 minutes worth, 10 minutes worth of information tops, and kind of register it with the online system. And what would then happen is it would create a file number. It would produce a PDF of a document that the person could then show to the community, to the municipality or county, say, hey, I've registered for this activity. The community, the town then can keep track of it. The state can keep track of it. We can run reports and say, in Mercer County, we issued this many activities in this watershed, and then look at how water quality might be affected in that watershed, and is there an opportunity for us to change our rules to address that? And then we can report to FEMA, here's everything that we've authorized within the special flood hazard area. Now, there's another piece to it, which will be after this slide, but I want to talk about permits by certification. So we ran reports on our permits by certification, and these are the ones where today you go online and you certify various things, and it creates a permit for you. Most of them have a fee associated with them, and you have to do public notice for them. We found that a lot of them are just rarely used or never used. There were some that only maybe 2 applications came in like a 5-year period. So we want our online system to be providing the most value to people, and this doesn't seem to be the best way to provide value. So we're folding some of them together. We're folding some of them into general permits so that the activities can be broadened. That's what we found out a lot, was that people were limited by the permit by certification and really couldn't use it. It was too limited, so they had to go to GPs anyway. So we want to reconcile that and make the general permits by cert really what they are. And the second piece is that, there are cases throughout, especially the flood hazard permits by certification, where people have to certify, I'm not in a floodway, or I'm not in this area, or, things that only really an engineer would be able to attest to. True story, the very, very first flood hazard permit by certification that ever was applied for, the person certified, it was a homeowner, they certified they were not in the floodway, and we had told them like the week before that they were definitely in a floodway and didn't qualify for the permit by certification. So it's that kind of thing where it creates a false sense of security, because people go on, they certify things, and until we catch it, it's maybe an activity could occur before we can catch it. So there would be an added step where not just anyone could apply for these permits by certification. In certain cases, a licensed professional engineer or an architect, depending on what the activity is, would be the ones to apply for the permits by certification on behalf of the homeowner or the applicant. And then the final slide before we go back to questions is what kind of noticing requirements should there be after, like, post permit? So, I've been at the state 34 years, spent, 20, 25 years doing permits, and we would spend a lot of time. We have a lot of very dedicated, diligent staff that spend a lot of time looking at every last detail of the rules, applying it to the project, making sure everything is the way it should be, crafting conditions, having a 10-page long permit that spells out everything so that everybody knows what they should do, and we send it on its way. And we don't often know if construction began. We don't often know if construction was completed. We don't know if it was completed right. And if we don't know when it's starting, then we can't send people out to inspect it. If we don't know when it's finished, we can't send people out to inspect it. So what this would do is, by using that same online portal system that I described for permits by registration, it would require that when you start construction, you just go online, put in your file number, and say, we intend to start working in the next 2 weeks, right? And then maybe that would be the default time frame. And so that way it goes into our system, and then we would know, okay, we should go out and take a look at this project and check it during construction. Same thing if there's a deed restriction filing, right? A lot of times we'll issue permits that say within 90 days you have to provide proof of a deed restriction on something, or a disclosure on your title, or within so many days you need to provide us calculations to show X, Y, and Z. And again, there's no automatic follow-up, right? It relies on the professional at DEP who wrote the permit to follow up on it. And so the system, our online electronic system, can be used for that. So let's say that there's a requirement that within 90 days you do X, Y, and Z, and you have to upload it through the service. And let's say it's not uploaded within 90 days. So on the 91st day, you'd get an email saying, hey, you were supposed to do this deed restriction. When do we expect it by? And if another, a couple weeks pass, then maybe there's a letter generated, and then it alerts the permit reviewer that this is happening, so that we can make sure that post-permit compliance is met. And the same thing with completion. Once something is completed, we used to have these forms. I guess we maybe still do, but it was very, very rare that we would see people do this notice of completion. And that way we can go and inspect the project and see if it's been built right. And sometimes as-built drawings are prepared. So this wouldn't require the preparation of as-built drawings, but photos or as-built drawings that exist, these are great things that can be uploaded into our system, and then that protects the permittee, because they're demonstrating that they built the thing the way that we permitted them to build it. And then finally, as I mentioned before, an automatic response from the online system if none of these things are received in a timely manner. So if your permit is expired and you've never submitted a completion notice or start a construction notice, then it would send out an email or a letter saying, hey, your permit is expired. Did you do the work? Are you coming back? And so on. So by having that feedback loop, we can better assess what kind of impacts we're having in watersheds. We can ensure compliance, and we can kind of see ways that we can improve. So to the question slide, and I'll stop sharing so that we can all see each other.
All right, Elliot Ruga.
Hey, Vince, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Elliot.
Hey. Do you anticipate any changes to WQMP rules to become consistent with these proposals?
So this proposal would not address WQMP, but we are looking at WQMP rules and looking at ways that we can address the things that have been raised to us. So it's not in this piece, but it is coming.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing those proposals. Thanks.
Thanks, Elliot.
All right, Grant, I know you had your hand up for a while, so I'm going to bump you back to the top of the list.
Yeah, not even topical to this rule, actually, as much as it affects the entire rule and the fluvial rule that's, under consideration right now. Everything discussed here is going to probably lead to a lot more individual permits, a lot more pre-application meetings. Is there going to be like department reorganization, additional hiring? I think maybe my members' biggest concern is that even if they're following the rules to the letter, it's going to mean longer processing times.
So hey, Grant, that's a good point, and it's true that by having more robust standards and having a more complex permitting process, there's more things to look at. It's more work for the staff. Because of the 90-day rules, right? The flood hazard rules and the coastal rules are bound by that. So I don't anticipate any impacts to that. And often freshwater wetlands permits are submitted concurrent with flood hazard or coastal permits. So we like to try to keep them together and process them together. So we'll do what we need to at DEP to address that, because we want to make sure that we're reaching that balance. We're being more protective, more holistic in our evaluation, but also not taking longer to do it. And honestly, one of the things, Grant, that will help that is by taking the attention of the staff off of some of the smaller things that we can automate and have them focus more on the permitting, right? So instead of someone worrying about, did I remember to let this person know, hey, that deed restriction that I approved, that permit with the deed restriction, did they ever submit it? I have to go look up the file. I have to figure out what happened with it. Or, having the system do a lot of that stuff, I think will take the work of that sort of accounting process, which is important, but can be done automatically. And that way the professionals can focus on what they were trained and educated to do.
I think that's a great part of the rule proposal. I'll, save my comments on the other parts of it for our, I guess, what do you want to call them? Topic specific meetings. And then maybe we can automate public notices next too. Thanks.
We can talk about that.
Sandy Blick.
Hey, Vinny, can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you, Sandy. Sorry. Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. Two questions. One is you indicated something about an off-ramp on the on-site retention. Could you speak to that a little bit? And kind of related is there the idea that there's going to be a associated technical manual with these rules as well?
Well, so I'll answer that question second. So the flood hazard technical manual would have to be amended to address the changes, right? So that would certainly happen. And I think that would cover pretty much anything that would happen in the coastal world, because the same things are happening in both, as far as like the inundation risk zone, the increases in the floodplain size and depth, and the different methods to determine it, and so on. So our technical manual would be amended. The on-site retention requirement, we recognize that there's situations where that can occur, right? If you have certain soil types where you can't infiltrate, then you can't infiltrate. So not having on-site retention is not going to work there. There's reusing the water. There's different ways that you can get to that. But sometimes the physical constraints of a site don't allow it either, right? Thinking of a roadway, for example, if you have right of ways and you've got different things impinging on the right of way, there might not be a location for you to do something like that. So the rule spells out what that looks like. And again, we can engage more precisely on that in future conversations so that you can understand a little bit better what it looks like.
Megan Bushlow.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Hi, Megan. Yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you for this presentation and the opportunity to find out more about the proposal. I actually have two questions, if that's all right. The first one is about the inundation risk zone and the requirements that include residential properties. They seem like they could be pretty onerous tasks for residents to complete the climate impact assessment and the climate risk alternatives analysis. So just curious if resources will be made available for residents to complete that, or if it will be required to be completed by a professional engineer or someone with specific certifications.
Yeah, so that's a really great point, and there are differences in the requirements and what's required and when it's required, depending on whether it's residential or non-residential or commercial and whatnot. So, if it's a single family home, there's the requirements, the narrative is going to look a lot different than if it's a 500 unit subdivision, right? It's commensurate with the amount of people, the number of people that might be put at risk, and the potential impact.
Okay.
So it would be addressed.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that clarification. And then the second question was just about, I think you were showing the NJ flood mapper and like the 5-foot sea level rise level, and we were looking at that, and it looks like there are these green areas that are like disconnected low-lying areas, and so we were curious if that is part of what would be the inundation risk zone, or if that would be excluded. And then if it is part of the inundation risk zone, if there were changes to the elevation through a project, if there would be a mapping update process to remove those areas.
That's a great question too. So you're right. The green areas are sort of isolated areas where water would pond and be below that elevation, right? So the mapping looks at the topography, and it said, okay, if we add 5 feet to mean high water line, what would be under it? And the blue is land that's connected to the ocean, and the green is the land that's not. So it could be stormwater ponds there and can't get out, or it backs up storm sewer systems. So that would be part of the inundation.
That is part of it. Okay.
Yeah. So, and the second part of your question relates to like, well, can you take yourself out of the IRZ, and will there be a remapping of it, right? So this online tool is just that. It's not the final, like, this is what you have to live with, right? This is an indication of what's there based on what we know. But we fully intend that folks will come to us with more site-specific data and say, okay, here's the topography of my site, and here's the mean high water line. And even though the map might show you in, I can show you very easily that I'm out because the land is actually higher than the map indicated, or the other way around. Or I might be partly in, and by raising the ground on my property 6 inches or 12 inches, I can maybe take myself out of that inundation risk zone. So all those things will be present in the rule.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
All right, anybody other hands up, or otherwise we'll go?
I think there's one hand
Yeah.
up, Megan.
Okay, yeah, Meg, that's who we were just speaking to.
That was me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And unfortunately, we have run out of time, so and we are doing this same presentation again on Monday. So let's wrap it up.
Yeah, no, I am always highly appreciative of the time that people take. 90 minutes is a big chunk of time. Obviously, it's very important. Hopefully what your takeaway is that our purpose is to do what's right for the people of New Jersey, for the long-term economics of the state, because there's a huge economic benefit to doing the right thing now and not waiting until later. And hopefully you've also heard that we're willing to continue this conversation in January. So let it sink in, come up with your ideas and questions, reach out to us, and we'll talk more. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a happy holiday season.